once again to Hobby Memorial Library event. This is an in-person. We're working towards in-person, although we love our virtual events as well. But we have two very special CTC professors here today. We have Dr. Kenneth Bass and we have Dr. Scott Craig, and they're going to be talking to us today about transhumanism. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and you guys take it away. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I'm a professor here in Social and Behavioral Sciences Department. So are most of you in the audience, in fact. I teach history, and one thing that you do in history is you specialize in a certain area of history. And this is something that is relatively new to me, this transhumanist field of study. So I just wanted to present a little bit about that to you today. But before I do, I'll have Kenneth tell you all a little bit about himself.
Kenneth Bass. I teach in social and behavioral sciences as well, noted. And the truth about transhumanism has been percolating in my mind since about 1996, when I first got involved with doing research on genetically modified organisms, which my colleagues probably are tired of hearing about by now. But it's been a fascinating journey to see how it has evolved over the years, and Dr. Craig and I have been talking about it quite a bit. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say, and I'll share a little bit with you in a moment.
All right, well, I think Kenneth might have a leg up on me, because when he started studying genetic modification, I think I was in junior high. So, good job. Okay, you all can hear me. I won't hold it too close. So the first thing that I thought I'd do this afternoon is to just sort of explain my interest in this, as Kenneth just did. I didn't become very interested in biology or, genetic modification really until I had my first child. Because that's the point in your life where people start telling you, hey, your kid looks like his mom, right? And so you start thinking a little bit more about how genes work, why people look like the way they do, why people may act the way they do in some instances, why people inherit certain traits, and so forth. So after my son was born about 8 years ago, I started thinking a little bit more about these things, which I wasn't really accustomed to doing, being a historian. In that context, I would start reading headlines of news articles that popped up on occasion on a fairly regular basis that talked about, really strange things that seemed like almost science fiction in nature. For example, chicken-human hybrid embryos created in laboratories. I would see headlines that talked about, sheep-human hybrids created in laboratories. And it does sound almost comical when you hear about it. As a matter of fact, some of the reactions that I see in the audience are the reactions that I used to get when I used to try to talk to people about this. And in fact, Kenneth is probably the only person who took me seriously when I started speaking about this with people. So I really appreciate that, by the way. So I'll go ahead and stand up here and just show you this series of slides that I have, which I think provide us a little bit of an explanation as to what transhumanism is according to their own definitions, but also what it is in historical context, meaning are there similarities to other movements promoting modification of humanity in the past? And there have been other movements, in fact, eugenics being one of them. So I thought we'd start with eugenics itself and talk a little bit about what that was, being a past movement to modify the human condition. And that word eugenics actually comes from the Greek literally, well born. Well born. And this is an image here taken from a poster that appeared at an international eugenics conference. So this is from the eugenicists themselves, sort of explaining their field of study. And you can see here next to this tree, under the word eugenics, it says, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So really that's the goal, right, is to create a method by which you can influence human evolution in the future. And so obviously, using that word evolution is significant, right? Because this is a reference to, of course, Darwinian theory, the theory of evolution, something espoused in the 19th century by Darwin and later other people like Herbert Spencer, who was an English philosopher. He really built upon Darwin's theory of evolution, and he's the one that coined the term survival of the fittest. And that's something that you often hear applied to Darwin and the theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. That's his term. That didn't, in fact, come from Darwin. Spencer's also responsible for a social movement called social Darwinism, in which Spencer and others believed at the time, in this really utilitarian perspective, that to really make humanity better, to weed out the parts of humanity that you don't want and to promote the parts of humanity that you do want, you don't intervene to help the people who are suffering. That's social Darwinism, right? You let nature take care of itself. That's the survival of the fittest. That's where that idea comes from. It's a very sort of cold philosophy, very cold rationale. But this word fittest, it was something that was widely adopted across people who were promoting the eugenics movement. So if you went back in time to the turn of the 20th century, the eugenics movement was widely popularized through conferences and events and expositions and so forth throughout the country. And you can see here one of those expositions, a building promoting eugenics, the eugenics movement. So you'll see this family right here. They were supposed to be the fittest family, right? They have the traits that are desirable. Put that in quotation marks. You can see they've won the governor's trophy. So there's a lot of people, even in power, political power at the time, that promoted this philosophy. Okay, here's a poster. This is a poster from one of these expositions, again, sort of describing, the traits that you want. So you want people to be pure, right? You can see that on the slide. What's purity? Is anybody pure? Of course not. But that was kind of the goal of the eugenicists, to create a pure version of humanity. And you'll see these other words, right? Abnormal, tainted, and so forth. So the idea here was that you could really weed out those people that the eugenicists believed were tainted or abnormal. Again, you'll see fit and unfit, okay? It's important. All right, here we've got a headline of an article. This article appeared in a Washington newspaper in the year 1915. You can see it says 15 million Americans defective, they said. As my colleague Merv reminded me the other day, the population of the United States around this time was just over, 100 million. So this is a significant part of the total population of the United States. Well, who's saying this? Okay, well, let's read a little bit further here. You can see it says, Mrs. E.H. Harriman, that's the heir to the gigantic railroad fortune. Mrs. E.H. Harriman's gigantic eugenic enterprise at Cold Springs Harbor, Long Island, to ascertain what is the matter with the human race, launched a campaign today for the sterilization of 15 million Americans. 15 million, it's a lot of people. Coincident with this amazing statement comes the announcement of the plan of the Eugenics Society, which will have at its disposal the vast fortune of Mrs. Harriman, liberal financial assistance from John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. So again, it's the people that have a lot of money that are funding this enterprise at the time. Okay, now eventually the eugenics movement just takes off, not just in the United States, but particularly in Nazi Germany. That's where we see it really evolve into probably one of the most horrendous episodes in history. You can see here, this is a quote from Hitler himself. He says, the demand that defective people be prevented from propagating equally defective offspring is a demand of the clearest reason, and if systematically executed, represents the most humane act of mankind. At least 400,000 people were ultimately sterilized in Nazi Germany. So, what does this mean? Well, initially, after the Second World War was over, much of the information about what the Nazis did in their sterilization programs and their eugenic programs wasn't widely known. That information didn't really penetrate into America until the 1960s. And so what we see in the 1960s is that the eugenics movement in this country starts to go underground, right? And that's evidenced by the journal here, Eugenics Quarterly, which really just changed its name to Social Biology in the late 60s. Okay, so that's eugenics, okay? What do the transhumanists want? Do they have similar goals? Do they want to alter humanity? Well, let's see what they have to say about that. So here we've got a quote from Nick Bostrom. He's a professor of philosophy at Oxford University. What does he say about transhumanism and transhumanists? He says, transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the end point of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human. Post-human beings with greater capacities than present human beings have. Okay, so that's one definition of transhumanism. It's always instructive to try to find an alternative, to see what someone else has to say about it. Okay, so here we've got Patrick Hopkins. He's a professor of philosophy at Millsaps College. This is what he has to say about it. He says, in this sense, the first element of a transhumanist moral vision is that the effort to address the human condition requires that we change the physical facts that in part generate the human condition. Curing the human condition requires altering the human part of the equation. Okay? So what kinds of things do we cure? Disease, right? Is the human condition diseased? Does everyone agree with that? You know, these are the questions that I think this definition should present to us. Okay, so here we've got a recent book, a relatively recent book by one of the leading transhumanists, who's a co-author. His name's Julian Savulescu. He's an Australian transhumanist. And I just wanted to point out the language in the title of the book, which is the same language that was propagated by the eugenicists at the turn of the century. This idea of fitness. Are you fit? Are you fit for the future? Well, apparently, according to Savulescu, we're not all fit for the future. So some of us may need to be morally enhanced. Morally enhanced. Okay, here we've got, this is taken from the National Library of Medicine. You'll see it says underneath the National Center for Biotechnology Information. And this is an article called Procreative Beneficence, why we should select the best children. And you'll see, this is again by Savulescu. The first word in the abstract is eugenic. Okay? So is this another form of eugenics? That's the question that we're asking. We're not trying to answer that question, we're just posing the question. Okay, so here we've got a relatively recent article from a few years ago. This is from The Guardian, very established British newspaper. It says, genetically modified babies given the go-ahead by the UK ethics body. So whether we realize it or not, the transhumanists are pushing for genetic modification currently, and some of them serve on bioethical boards across the world, including Nick Bostrom. Okay. We also have an article here that talks a little bit about that genetic modification taking place. So this used to be something that most people would consider science fiction, right? We'd all sort of joke about it and think about it. Someday this kind of thing is going to happen, but we don't know when. But in fact, it's happening right now. It's happening before our eyes. And it's continuing to happen. It will continue to happen in the future. So we have to prepare ourselves for the outcome of whether or not we're going to embrace these changes. So you can see here, this says, Chinese scientist claims to use CRISPR to make first genetically edited babies. I don't know if any of you had followed this story, but this scientist actually disappeared for a period of time after this was announced. And he disappeared for a little while, in fact.
Scott? Sorry, what is CRISPR?
CRISPR. It's a technology designed to change genes, change people's DNA. Yeah. Okay. Here we've got the headline of an article. This is from Medium. It says, the case for genetically engineering ethical humans. We've debated ethics as human beings for a very long time through something called religion, right? That's why people go to mosque, why people go to church, why people go to temple. But now there's the potential to genetically modify a kind of morality into people's DNA, right? So do we need genetic modification to be more moral people? Are we bad? Here we've got an example of maybe part of that genetic modification that some claim would be a good thing to solve certain issues. This is from a website called Open Mind. You can see the headline here. It says, tackling climate change through human engineering. Okay, so the idea being that instead of taking responsibility for the things that we do, we just genetically modify the population in order to make the problem go away, right? So let's see what the author of this has to say, the author being Matthew Liao, who you can see here works at the Center of Bioethics. So he says, human-induced climate change is one of the biggest problems that we face today. We're not debating that. If we move a little bit further down here, he says, I shall argue that human engineering is potentially less risky than geoengineering, and that it could make behavioral and market solutions more easy to succeed. Behavioral and market solutions. So you genetically engineer the population to accept, a given solution to a problem. We have some very outlandish headlines like these, talking about genetic engineering and transhumanism. Stephen Hawking predicted that genetically engineered superhumans could destroy humanity. This is from Newsweek. Hawking, of course, died a few years ago, passed away. But this was one of the things that came out posthumously, after his death. So, this sounds like science fiction. It all sounds like science fiction until we read that this is going on right now, right? So this is an article from NBC News. It says, China has done human testing to create biologically enhanced super soldiers. So when they say they did human testing, that means that they did it, right? that means that they went through with it, that it's been done, okay? So we're right on the verge of really a new threshold for humanity, where we're going to see a lot of change, particularly at the genetic level. And it's going to cause a lot of confusion in the future. So I think that we all should think a little bit more about these things and the consequences of doing them. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass the mic to Kenneth here.
If you just minimize it, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Very informative. I always learn something when I talk to Scott. And it's nice to be able to learn something that you both share an interest in. As he mentioned, one of the primary ideas behind transhumanism and posthumanism is the belief that we're probably at a very early stage in human development, certainly in human evolution. The assumption that they're making is that it's very early and we have a long way to go, and we might as well do it ourselves and do it right. So that's the assumption. And as you noticed, Scott pointed out several times, who gets to say what is right? That's probably our main concern in these presentations. Current humanity is not the end, so we need to use technology like genetic engineering to speed up the process. The post-human is another point of view. Post-human means that humans as we are, as Scott mentioned, the moral concern, as we are, we're a problem. We are a disease that needs to be cured. That's the post-human view. And this comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said once God is dead, anything is possible, and one of the things you need to do is you need to overcome this current limit on humanity and stop saying we can't do this, we can't do that. You can do whatever you want to do, because there's nothing in the way to stop you from doing whatever you want to do. And Nietzsche was optimistic in the sense that he thought we would always do the right thing, and that we would not, we wouldn't go down the rabbit trail. So I wanted to compare transhumanism with genetic engineering just for a moment to point out the difference. The bottom line is that genetic engineering is just one of several tools, we'll see in a moment, that transhumanists hope to use. Okay, so genetic engineering is not transhumanism. It's just a tool that they anticipate using. Transhumanism, as Scott pointed out, is a philosophy of life. It's a belief that we can and should overcome our current limitations. And they define limitations in a very specific way. So we have a philosophy versus a tool. And genetic engineering is being used widely around the world, even as we speak, to accomplish all sorts of things. Some that may have some benefit, some seem to have some benefit, others are questionable. So transhumanism seeks to access any option, and that includes AI and other things as well, for life extension and expansion. Those are kind of code words. Life extension, live longer, and life expansion. Increase the ways in which we can be human. And they are very clever at how they go about expanding life. Nietzsche, you may know him, you may have heard of him. He's a theoretical physicist. He shows up a lot on interviews about the cosmos. He has a book titled Physics of the Future. And he says, he makes claims like this, that by 2100, the year 2100, we will be like the gods of old. He thinks we'll be able to move things with just thought, that we will have pretty much merged fully with machines by that point. And so life expansion is not limited by anything you've seen in science fiction. They have gone far beyond that. Full body prosthetics, where you just replace your physical body with a full sleeve, made out of a certain kind of material, and you can upload your consciousness to a stack, and that stack can be switched from sleeve to sleeve. You'll see in a moment, it has some very, very important social benefits. Transhumanism is primarily about enhancing humans. Genetic engineering is primarily about therapy. There's always been this debate about therapy versus enhancement with any technology that we adapt. Therapy, curing diseases, solving problems. Enhancement, taking something that's working just fine and making it work better according to someone's ideal of what better may be. Genetic engineering theoretically can be used to insert desired traits. Well, it's a genetic tool. Well, there are people out there as we speak working on trying to determine which genes are responsible for which traits. And when they figure that out, they will be able to implant those genes because they can make those genes synthetically in the lab. They just make the gene and they implant it in the human, and through using a virus to replicate it, it spreads to all the cells as the cells reproduce it. Eventually, within about a month, that person has fully adopted that trait. And so they've switched now from just being simply about genetic engineering to doing full or chromosomal activity to doing full genes. Some areas of concern for transhumanism, genetic engineering, which we just mentioned, artificial intelligence, the idea of merging human minds with machines, been around for a long time. They are working on it with significant funding as we speak, being able to replace different sections of the brain with circuit boards to see to what degree they'll continue to function normally. Nanotechnology, you've probably heard about little nanobugs that are going to do this, that, and the other, go into your body and make changes. Probably one you're not as aware of is marketing. If you can convince people, especially young people, that they could buy a CRISPR unit online, which you can do right now for $99, and you can build a injectable CRISPR unit to put into your skin that will turn your skin blue for a few days or a week, and then it will slowly fade back to your normal skin tone. How many people you think would sign up for that just to be different for a week? We've seen it with hair and tattoos and other things for generations. People do these kinds of things. Don't think for 1 second, you guys are smarter than that, right? Don't think for 1 second people won't adapt this. And then, where do you go from turning your skin blue? Where else can you go? Oh, we can enhance your eyes so you can have 20/20 vision at a mile. You can see clearly. Now you got people all around the room looking up, right? Well, what if we can just help you get rid of your glasses forever? And then you start to market it in ways that it replicates itself. Right, well, if I have this app, I can also do this, right? If I have this platform in my skin, I can do this, like a PICC line. Think of a PICC line when you're in the hospital. And we can just inject this, and you can go modify this. It's much more widespread, and it's much better developed than I think we're even aware. Human self-interest. We tend to get what we want. We're pretty good at it. And when we want something, we find ways to make it happen. So what does transhumanism want? One of the things it wants, in a statement from 2014, is whole brain emulation. And they refer to this as the holy grail of life extension. So this is basically being able to upload your consciousness into a stack and put it into a new sleeve, and you are immortal at that point. And unless somebody deletes your stack for some reason, see all these new problems that are going to crop up? Someone deletes your stack, or they hack your stack. That's just waiting for somebody to make a joke about it, right? Hacking your stack. So the whole brain emulation is just one. But by 2022, we're looking now at a much closer network relation with both machines and nature. And we're going to, maybe you've heard of Elon Musk, Neuralink, we're going to wire ourselves into the internet. But you won't have to search, you won't have to carry a phone or anything like that. You will be the phone. Two moral theories that I think I want to throw out there. One is social contract theory, and there's a political component to it and an ethical component to it. So the assumption that I want to bring is the transhumanists are saying that it is good for all of us to reduce social chaos and create peace. Now, I told you there were some unique benefits. Well, if we can design humans in such a way that their sleeve is no longer an object of racism, boom. You just ended racism. I mean, you can literally go down to the sleeve store and put your stack in a female-looking sleeve or a male-looking sleeve or an old person-looking sleeve or a young, sexy-looking person sleeve. You can literally be whatever you want to be because the sleeves, as they envision it, will be endless. It's, again, limited only by your imagination. Sexism, the whole idea of being male or female, out the window. You don't need to worry about it anymore. Genderism, right? No need to worry about transgender. All that's gone. You can literally be whatever you want. Just move your stack around. No more expensive surgeries. None of that. Lust and violence. We just get rid of all of it. We program it in such a way that it's controlled by the central planning committee. And if you start to do something wrong, they just shut down your stack for a moment. Yes.
Well, I saw this movie. It was called Replicas by Keanu Reeves. And the movie suggested that a person could get to the point where he's totally replaced by a robot, only it looks like a human being and it has flesh like a human being, but it has a human being's consciousness. So my thought is, that seems thinkable, but hard to believe.
Well, it's hard to believe right now. And that's the whole point of transhumanist education. They want to educate us that this is possible, that we should stop thinking that it's impossible, because it's not impossible. So the question under social contract theory is this a decision that we've all made together when we've agreed to say we're going to give up some liberties, we're going to give up some uniqueness in order to be a better type of person or a better type species? Have we done that together, or do you guys kind of feel like this has been done by someone else up to this point? And most of you are looking at us like a cow looking at a new gate, right? You're not real sure what this is or whether to believe it. It's being developed largely without asking any of our permission or involving us, right? There's a mantra related to able-bodiedness that says, nothing about us without us. In other words, don't make any decisions about us without us. And I think it may be time for humans to step up and say, no, you don't get to make decisions about changing what it means to be a human without letting all of us in on this little conversation. So, just to throw that out as one possible theory that we could discuss a little further. The prima facie duties, there's an assumption here, when we look at transhumanism, we might say, it's okay, they're not going to do anything that's going to harm our species. They would never do anything that would delete humanity from the surface of the earth. Well, if you have a worldview called post-humanism, and you think humanity is a disease to be cured, you might be glad to see it go. And these people are not insignificantly placed around the world. They're in some of the best universities with a lot of money behind them. So, what is our greater duty regarding transhumanism? Well, prima facie duty says this. If I agree to meet Scott at 9 o'clock in the morning to play golf, and at 7:45 my daughter gets bit by a rattlesnake, do I still have an obligation to meet him at 9 o'clock? Or has a greater duty inserted itself in my duty to keep my promise, keep my word, which is a duty that most societies recognize. Keep your word. Well, is saving a life a duty that is immediately more valuable than meeting him at the golf course? I think most of us would agree, absolutely. So the question here is the desire to enhance ourselves greater than the collective right to remain human? And that's a decision we have to make, right? It's not something I can make. It's not something Scott can make or anyone else can make. It's something that we collectively have to decide. Can we do this? Is it okay for us to do this? Uncertainty, I'll wrap it up with this and tell you a very brief excerpt from my life that makes this relevant for me. There's a lot of uncertainty in science. I don't know to what degree you're familiar with how science works, but there's many scientists who, when they look at what genetic engineering is doing and transhumanism is doing, say, we should assume that it could potentially be as bad as we imagine it to be and worse. If it's possible to do something, that doesn't mean we ought to do it. Just because we can doesn't mean we ought to. We know that. We tell our kids that all the time, right? So going way back to Cicero, we have this idea that we ought to at least think about what future evils might come. And one of the reasons we can't do that in our current society is because so many people don't know about transhumanism. They don't even know it's a thing. And when you tell them about it, they look at you rather strangely and act as if you just insulted all of their ancestors. Okay? A scientist who, professor of math and statistics at Concordia, wrote this book called Blind Spot. And I thought this quote was worth sharing with you. Many people will be surprised by the assertion that some things cannot be understood. These people inhabit what I will call the culture of certainty, who imagine that science proceeds by totally mastering some particular aspect of reality before moving on to the next bit in the way an army conquers foreign terrain. The army in this case would be rationality itself. If some aspects of reality cannot really be grasped, then science never conquers any territory. So the concern here is that we're putting our eggs all in the basket of science and saying, oh, they have it all figured out. When we saw from Scott's reference to eugenics that they don't. That was a big scientific blunder because we sterilized over 700,000 people in the United States of America. And if you don't know, in Hitler's great work, Mein Kampf, he quotes the American eugenicists broadly and with favor, referring to them as where he got his ideas. This is widely known. Brief story about me. My dad passed away in 1964, about 6 months before I was born, from complications of a disease known as Marfan syndrome. It is, as you can see here, a mutation on the FBN1 gene, which is located in chromosome 15. He had no idea what it was. Nobody did in 1964. Well, he passed that trait on to my sister, and my sister passed it on to her son. You may know people who have this. They're real tall, real thin. My dad was 6'8", my nephew is 7'2", but they're real thin. They have complications, unbelievable complications. And it is primarily connective tissue related. What kills them is the aorta will expand, and it will eventually create an aneurysm and then dissect. That's what killed him. It's a genetic disorder, completely a mutation on that particular gene. The problem in this case is that the mutations are over 1,300. Over 1,300 mutations. We don't have science that can go in and edit each one of those DNA and change it. But what we do have is we have people working on entire gene replacement. So you can actually go in and replace the entire gene. And I've had this conversation with my sister. This is a real life scenario for her and my nephew, and perhaps my nephew's children, that you could get rid of a disease that is very debilitating by just going in and having an injection and let your cells do their normal replication, and after about a month or so, you have a whole new body. That's pretty attractive. That's the therapy side. But you can use that same technology for enhancement, and that's the side that Scott and I are trying to raise some level of concern about. Should we, because we can embrace the therapy side, should we embrace the enhancement side? Okay, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Y'all ready for questions?
Yes, fire away.
Okay, I also have, we have golden heart syndrome in my family where it creates brain damage and just deformities that have been gone through my family. So I think that would be a total gift to be able to change something genetically. But at the same time, when you spoke about the Chinese army creating super soldiers, it's like, who gets to say what is the best of humanity? Because if they feel that someone who can shoot the straightest, run, take over physically, is that better than a quiet human being who doesn't have the strength but will create peace? Like some of our heroes in our life have been very peaceful, calm people, and that also increased humanity. And so who would be the dude who made the decision what was the best? I see that as far greater danger than having golden heart syndrome in my family. I don't know, what do y'all feel?
I think you've sort of put your finger on the question that is our primary concern, and that is who gets to make these kinds of decisions for all of us? How are those decisions sorted out? What is the bioethical body that's supposed to oversee a lot of this stuff that's going on? And, it's quite unclear. I think considering the magnification of and potential for change in the future of humanity, we would need some kind of entity like the International Atomic Energy Agency, right, which oversaw, nuclear proliferation throughout the world, ensuring that some countries, maintained regulations surrounding atomic energy and so forth. We don't have that. That's a problem.
Yeah, that's very true. I don't get the term. So yeah, that's very true. We don't have that. We did have, in 2003, the President's Commission on Bioethics. And they dealt with this issue of therapy versus enhancement. And you raised the question, basically, that I ended with, that we have therapy to potentially address genetic mutations in human beings, especially those that are transmissible. But does that give us the right to then go out and enhance ourselves in ways, especially, this is one of the bigger problems, especially when they're irreversible? If they are irreversible, then how are we going to know that? How are we going to know if these genetic changes can be reversed? Now, current state of genetic engineering, there are certain switches that you can turn on and turn off to deactivate what you've done. Is that going to apply to whole body genome changes? Just a lot of uncertainty about all of it. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Herb?
Hey, Scott, you talked about the eugenics and the propaganda. Can you expand on the way they try to get people to support eugenics at the turn of the century, so we can maybe better understand how they're trying to manipulate us to understand things today?
Yeah, well, I think language is a big part of that, obviously, as it usually is with propaganda, and, using this word fit, right? Fitness, we tend to think is a desirable thing. So the fact that the eugenicists used this word fit to describe the desirable, the pure, unpure, and so forth, should give us pause, considering that's the exact language that some of these transhumanists are using as well. They're using the word fitness. Are we fit? Morally, we fit physically? Are we fit intellectually? Well, who gets to decide that? You know, and that's what we're asking.
Merv, on that same point, I have a book in my library entitled Preaching Eugenics. The religious movement was very much a part of that between 1900 and 1940. As a matter of fact, they had contests to see who could preach the most eugenics-friendly sermons. And they went after it, and they were completely on board with the idea that bringing the kingdom of God on earth meant to change people so that they would be morally acceptable to the kingdom of God, which had been the purview of salvation for any number of years, decades, centuries, right? So, yeah, religion is definitely in on this as well. We're already seeing books come out where talking about immortality, maybe this, living forever, eternal life. Well, eternal life and immortality are pretty much the same thing. So, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, a lot of them talk about in eternal life. Well, if you can create eternal life here, does that mean that's now the new plan of salvation? Next. Yes.
Have you read anything about if you change one trait in the genome, like say the super soldiers, who are super strong and maybe they're very great tactical minds, but they have no empathy, and then they have children, and then they have children. Has there been any research about how these small changes can magnify over time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of research. As a matter of fact, the people that support genetic engineering the most will tell you that CRISPR, this technology that you asked about, Storm, that this technology is far from exact. There's a much more exact technology called zinc scissors, which is, it's precise, but it's 40 times as expensive. And so you see what's going to happen there. So CRISPR technology is notorious for breaking things off that weren't intended to be broken off, for editing things that weren't intended to be edited. It literally goes in and snips the genome open. It pulls it open, pulls the double helix open, and rips out the section that needs to be ripped out. And then it leaves the gene to put itself back together. And the gene doesn't always do what they thought it was going to do. But worse, CRISPR doesn't you have to program it. You literally have to program it to do exactly what you want to do. And if you don't program it to do exactly what you want to do, once it gets into the DNA, it can just go haywire and make all kinds of changes. Okay, so if you're not a really good CRISPR programmer, you should leave CRISPR alone. Because CRISPR can end up creating some significant problems.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. If you think about modern medicine, we're just at this point now in our understanding of the human body and genetics and so forth, where we're beginning to understand the consequences of genetics as it's been passed down from one generation to the next, as cultures and societies and ethnic groups, intermarried, and one group is conquered over another and so forth for millennia. We're just understanding the consequences of all of that now. So we're also at this point in time where we're really opening Pandora's box, where we can manipulate genes very quickly that took, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years to develop through, nature. So I would point out that there's probably significant consequences to that manipulation that we cannot foresee.
I will say this also, and Joyce, I see your hand. I'll say this also. We didn't talk any about it because we didn't have time, but there's this additional branch or new component in the world of genetics called epigenetics. And epigenetics is where we see the role of the environment turning on and turning off genes to some degree. Well, not to be outdone, the geneticists went out and created a tool to modify the epigenes. So now, instead of waiting for culture or your environment to activate a certain gene because you're doing something that your body thinks that gene needs to be activated. Now they're working on the capability of going in and doing the last thing that nature was left to do. Is that where you were going?
I was going to into epigenetics, but really, in your reading, has it discussed epigenetics and the influence that you have a changed generation, but the mother carrying the baby to the next generation is affected by environment, and that can make, we found that from World War II, that can make a significant change, really unbelievable change in the next generation. Has there been a discussion in that?
Absolutely. I mean, as these problems come up and these challenges come up, people are talking about it at the scientific level. Well, our concern is that it's not trickling down to us, that we're not talking about it, and we're the large majority that will be affected by this if we don't pull our collective heads out and start to pay attention to what's actually going on out there. So yes, they're talking about that in the literature. That, and you know, as I mentioned, epigenetics was like the safe space in genetic engineering. Like you could go in and switch things on and off, but there was still an activation component to society and environment that, you know, there are certain things that turn it on, and even if you turn it off, it might be turned back on because of the habits a person has or things they're exposed to. So yeah, but the problem, as I see it, is that even that's no longer safe. And I don't know that it's a problem, but it's a problem in the sense that we don't know what, it's kind of, we're looking in that murky window, you know, kind of like looking out the windows of our classroom, you know, that shaded glass.
Getting with what you said, that was something I thought of too, environmental. We're not that smart in every single area. You know, the guys who are working on this may not be all that smart on environmental science. I mean, you know, the non-stick pans created environmental, you know, environment and climate change problems. So are we smart in every single area, these people who are doing this, that they see how this, you know, the environment 10 years from now may affect that change? It's just kind of scary that nobody's that smart on everything. You know, we're going to mess something up because humans tend to mess stuff up big time.
A little bit.
A little bit.
And maybe that's one reason why no one wants to oversee this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Because no one wants to take responsibility for what could go wrong, and what could go wrong is pretty bad.
Yeah, with nuclear bombs, you know.
Yeah.
When you play God, you incur the wrath of God, number one. Number two, the wrath of humanity, that is the inability to understand what we're doing to the extent that we're able to create something that we can't unfix because we're always fixing things. Some things you can't unfix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the very idea behind progress, right? It has no goal. There's no telos. There's no end point. It's just get in the car, sit down, shut up, and hold on. Where are we going? I don't know. We're just going. Which way? That way. And we won't ever know when we get there because we don't have an end point in mind. There's not a place where we will say, or we've shown a reticence to admit that there's a place where we could say, this is good enough. Nothing's ever good enough. So we're going to be caught in this loop of improvement, and improvement's not that far from the word enhancement, right? So that's our concern here, is just to let you guys know, let other people know, and you talk to the people you know, and just be aware, start paying attention to what's being said out there and what's being done. I mean, addictive technology has been promulgated on our children for decades now, and we've just kind of sat back and said, oh, they should do a better job of putting their phones down. One of the quotes in this book is absolutely fascinating. He says, It's not about your willpower when you've got 1,000 people on the other side of that screen making sure you pick it up again. They're getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to make sure you keep picking it up. To make sure that you don't set it down and walk away from it. It's not about willpower. You've got an army arrayed against you. And these kids and a lot of people don't stand a chance when it comes to fighting off the impulse and the urge to pick it up and look at it and go, distracted technology. We have ancient brains with modern technology.
I agree. Yeah, I think we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing the things that we do? And this is really the root of philosophy, right? Because unfortunately, I think part of the human condition is we live in this world and we sort of accept how it is and we don't ask questions. We sort of go to work and then we come home and we take care of the kids and we're very busy. But being able to ask these kinds of questions at least gives us the latitude to make this process a little bit more democratic.
I think we need to consider the human spirit, which you can't form with the gene. The human spirit is there. I've worked for years with many disordered individuals and watched them overcome things that they shouldn't physically be able to overcome or intellectually be able to overcome, and experience that exhilaration with them. That goes beyond what we're talking about here. I really believe, and I just have this faith in this indomitable human spirit that needs to be displayed in this thought about engineering.
I agree. Any other questions or comments? Fears, anxieties,
Yeah, I'm
dreams,
terrified
visions,
now.
nightmares,
I am.
hallucinations? Don't be afraid, be informed. We fear what we don't know. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. This was great. I just want to remind everybody, this Wednesday we have Fort Hood doing an archaeology program on our Facebook, so please check in for that. And we have lots more events, so just check to see what events we have. Thank you all so much for coming.